Okay, great. Hi, my name is Rachel Portinga. I'm the coordinator for the Lake Superior Living Labs Network. And this is part of a series that we do called mini meetups, where we gather for just under an hour. Someone or two people present on the work that they do in the Lake Superior watershed. And usually that takes 30, 40-ish minutes. And then whatever time we have left, we use for Q&A. So for folks, as you go along, feel free to add questions into the chat so you don't lose them, or take note wherever, and we'll open it up for a discussion at the end. I did want to acknowledge that the Lake Superior watershed occurs on Anishinaabe lands, and we're all here living, well, most of us I think are living and working on those lands. And so that's where this work is being done. And that is where our Living Labs network is always trying to re-engage and be respectful in that. So we do have a small enough group today. I would love to do some really quick introductions if you could. So I'll just call names because I think that'll be the fastest way to do it. If you want to unmute and share your name, where you're joining from today, particularly as it might relate to the watershed, and a title or a position or whatever makes the most sense for you. And we'll just do it real quick. And Brian, you're already unmuted, so go ahead, you go first.
Okay, Brian McLaren, Lakehead University.
Great, thanks. Rob?
Robert Stewart, Lakehead University.
Donald?
So Don Schreiner, and I worked for 25 years with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources managing Minnesota's portion of Lake Superior. And I retired in 2014, but I wasn't very good at it. So now I'm working with Minnesota Sea Grant half-time, working with fisheries and, believe it or not, some aquaculture work. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I've worked with Michael before on a couple different committees, and just always like to get the Canadian perspective on things.
Great, thanks, Don. Reg? Hopefully you can unmute there.
Sorry, did you call on me, Rachel? Okay.
I did, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, Reg Nelson. I'm a technician in the Department of Geography here at Lakehead in the Thunder Bay campus. And I end up supporting and being involved in some research in the watershed. So I thought I would take part.
Great, thank you. Naren?
Hi, everyone. My name's Naren Cameron. I'm a faculty in geography at Algoma University, and really happy to be here. And we're at the Rapids, so that's my water reference.
Great, thank you. Paige, go ahead.
Hi, I'm in my final year of water resource science at Lakehead University. I also work with Rob with Info Superior and RAP, and I've taken Mike Rennie's fish biology class before, so let's hear some interesting stuff.
Cool, thanks, Paige. And Randy, go ahead.
Greetings. This is Randy Hampson from Duluth Hub, and I'm looking forward to learning about the lake from the Canadian perspective here. And I am on my phone, so I'm not going to have my video on, given the connection.
Sounds good, no problem. Thanks, Randy. Great, at this point, I'll pass it over to Mike. Mike, you can share your screen, and maybe I'll, at the 30-minute mark, I'll maybe give you a heads up. Does that sound good?
Heads up. That sounds great. Yeah, thanks, Rachel.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, here, give me a second to make sure I can get this going. Share, and then if I do, hang on a sec, this. Okay, so that's working for everybody? Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, I guess first off, thanks to Rachel for inviting me to give a presentation today. I did sort of design this to do two things, I guess. One was to be fairly high level for folks that don't know necessarily a lot about the lake or its history as it relates to fisheries. And two, to not so much to beat my own drum, but rather beat the drum of the students that I've had working in my lab over, well, since I got to Lakehead, really. in 2015 that give me a chance to sort of highlight some of their the research that they've been doing. So that's sort of what I'm doing today. So if and I would say, there's probably a lot more that I could cover with regards to the history of the Lake Superior fishery and ongoing research on the lake, but I'm really, it's only 35 minutes, so I had to pick and choose. Anyway, but happy to answer any questions that I might be able to answer at the end as well. Okay, here we go. So for those of you who don't know, which would be surprising, this is Lake Superior, which we're all living in the watershed of this lake. It is the largest lake in the world by surface area, containing 10% of the world's fresh water. An interesting statistic for those who might not think about the lake in these terms is the turnover rate in the lake is 191 years. So basically a drop of water that falls in Lake Superior on average takes about 200 years to go through the whole lake, right? So quite a high residence time. It's a very large system. And there's evidence of human use around Lake Superior dating back to about 10,000 years, which corresponds basically with when the glacial ice sheet retreated from Lake Superior and provided lands that people could come in and occupy. And a lot of the evidence that's been collected to show what people were doing around here includes, lots of things that, people were doing 10,000 years ago, but lots of evidence of fishing. So, and even as we go sort of further into more recent history, it's clear that fisheries have always been a really important part of Lake Superior in terms of how people relate to the lake. The European settlers first arrived in and around the Lake Superior shores in 1616. And it was through that whole time critical to the First Nations that occupied these lands in the first place, but also to missionaries and fur traders that came in and decided to try and eke out a living here too. And there's an interesting quote that I've stumbled across from going through some reading here, and that it's from like a Jesuit diary or something from a Jesuit priest saying, a single fisherman will catch in one night 20 large sturgeon or 150 whitefish or 800 herring in one net, which, pretty impressive, especially the sturgeon part. So we definitely have sturgeon in Lake Superior now, but I think really, I think if you read any sort of fisheries history, lots of places had a lot more sturgeon back in the day. And we just haven't seen those numbers in a very long time, largely owing to their long-lived life history. If you go back through the Hudson Bay archives in Winnipeg, which you can do online, you'll actually find records of harvest. And I actually had the opportunity to work with Pace Plat First Nation to summarize some of those data around old fort establishments in those regions, and everything's sort of recorded as barrels of fish. And a barrel is a 200-pound quantity of salted fish, and that would get those would be captured on the shores here and sent to other outpost forts where the salted fish would last for quite some time. Commercial fisheries were initiated in Lake Superior waters in around the 1800s, and really sort of ramped up. But some other sort of important things to keep in mind with how that all relates to where the fishery ended up are a couple of other things. So flow regulation on the lake started in around 1922, primarily around being able to generate hydroelectricity. And then through the development of that commercial fishery, modernization in the 1870s really allowed it to ramp up, which was I would say I don't think many folks would argue, was a pretty big contributor to the collapse of the fishery in the 1960s. And this sort of shows, this graph tries to sort of show that. So this is this figure actually occurs in a couple of different publications. But what we're looking at here, the dotted line sort of demonstrates what's going on with the fishery in terms of yields. And this is in thousands of pounds, okay? And you can see it sort of steadily ramping up and up through the late 1800s, around that time of modernization of the fishery, and peaking through up until about the 1940s. 1941, I guess, was the peak catch there at 25 million pounds or 11.6 million kilograms, and then it really kind of declined from there. There's lots of different ways of trying to understand how many fish Lake Superior is capable of holding. One way is, and a simple way, is through the morphoedaphic index, which was developed by Dick Ryder here in Thunder Bay. So I feel like it's a relevant index to use. But if you believe the morphoedaphic index, it'll tell you that Lake Superior, based on the nutrients and the size of the lake, can support at a sustainable rate of harvest about 1 kilogram of fish per hectare per year. And so if you scale that up to the size of the lake, you can figure out what this estimated sustainable harvest is in the lake. And I've drawn that on this figure with a red line. And so the thing to keep in mind here is that if that's your sustainable harvest, then the harvests that we saw between, say, 1915 to almost 1960 were at levels that were, for the most part, at or exceeding that sustainable harvest for almost the entire duration of that time period. So it's not surprising that when you're taking out more fish than the lake can actually support, that you ultimately see this decline on the right-hand side of the figure. Overfishing, however, isn't the entire story for why the fishery collapsed on Lake Superior, as well as through all the other Great Lakes. In 1913, construction began on the Welland Canal so it existed, but in 1913, they underwent renovations to actually deepen the canal to allow larger ships to pass through and go basically up past Niagara Falls and into Lake Erie. But by deepening that channel, what it also did is permit the passage of sea lamprey from Lake Ontario into the upper Great Lakes. And this is another figure that you can find in several different places, but it largely shows sort of when lamprey sort of were able to get in and occupy different parts of the lakes. You know, they list the 1800s here for Lake Ontario. There's debate as to whether they might have just been in there earlier than that anyway. But certainly it's only after the renovations were done to the Welland Canal that they were spotted in Lake Erie in 1921. And then it didn't take very long for them to come up into the upper Great Lakes. So the 1930s for Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, and the late 1930s into Lake Superior. And so now keeping in mind this issue of potential overharvest, you can also see how the decline in fisheries yield historically, and this is across all of the Great Lakes, declined just as sea lamprey sort of really ramped up in numbers. So as they gained access to the upper Great Lakes, and for anyone who doesn't know why sea lamprey would matter to commercial fish, they have this rasping mouth part. So they look like, I don't know, what's the best? So if there's any Star Wars fans in the audience, when they're like in the stomach of that thing in Empire Strikes Back, and those Minocs come and they got those like sucker faces on the window of the Millennium Falcon. That's basically what a sea lamprey mouth looks like. And so they'll bore a hole into especially cold water fishes like lake trout and lake whitefish, and essentially, feed on their body fluids. And sometimes lake trout and whitefish and other deep water species can survive those attacks. Other times they can't. And so having lamprey in the system was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back that really pushed things downwards after that issue with commercial harvest. And so this just shows in Lake Superior, looking specifically at lake trout. So you can see that harvests were declining through the 1930s, 40s, and into the 50s. Originally, we can think of, sea lamprey showed up around 1940 in the lake, and they only really started monitoring numbers of lamprey in the mid 50s, but you can see how sort of those higher numbers are also associated with that big decline in lake trout numbers. And more importantly, we don't start to see recovery in lake trout until lamprey control measures go into place. And those lamprey control measures are in place around all of the Great Lakes, and co-funded by both Canada and the US, and a large part of why the International Joint Commission exists today. It's a multi-million-dollar annual investment from both the Canadian and the US government, but that, however many millions it is that they spend every year on lamprey control, I think it's something like 13 million per year, helps support a commercial and, more importantly, recreational fishery on the Great Lakes that's worth billions of dollars a year. So it sounds like a lot of money to spend, but the economic benefit that it spins off ultimately is makes it worthwhile. So we do have several introduced species in the Great Lakes, fewer in Lake Superior, but we do have them. I'm just going to focus on some of the fish that are of sort of recreational interest. So, steelhead fishing is on Lake Superior. These are indeed an introduced species. They were introduced in the late 1800s along with brown trout in several tributaries around Lake Superior, and they've since naturalized in many of those same tributaries. Rainbow smelt found their way into the lake in around 1915 to 1920. Again, smelting in the spring down on tributaries is a big deal, and lots of people love doing that at night. But actually an introduced species to the lake. Pink salmon originally, there's different stories depending on who you talk to about how they got into the lake, but in and around the Thunder Bay area in the 1960s. And then in the late 60s, largely around this sort of collapse of the native salmonid in the lake trout, they started stocking Pacific salmonids, so things like coho and Chinook salmon in the mid 60s. And we can talk about the reasoning behind that and where that all sort of went later if people are interested. So despite those introductions of non-native salmonids, and compared to the other Great Lakes, Lake Superior actually has a really high diversity of native salmonids. And I'm including in that sort of bin of salmonids also the corygonids. So these are things that we think of like either cisco or whitefish. And people may find that surprising. A lake herring is a lake herring, right? But not really if you read some of the Great Lakes literature. And there's also several different morphs of lake trout that are recognized in Lake Superior, and where we only tend to see these kinds of diverse morphs in large lakes if we go much further north. So places like Great Bear and Great Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories, we see some of this ecological diversity among lake trout that we really don't see in the lower Great Lakes, but seems to still be preserved in Lake Superior. And so this just shows visually what some of those different morphs and species look like. So on the left-hand side are all the corygonids. And this is just the herrings, so it doesn't include whitefish. But Corygonus artidae is the lake herring. That's what our commercial fishermen are out fishing for in November in Thunder Bay to collect the roe, which is a fairly popular, it drives the commercial fishery for these guys anyway, and a lot of that gets shipped off to Scandinavia. Corygonus hoyi, which is bloater, and then the kai as well. Both of these are smaller, tend to be deeper water corygonids that are really important for different types of lake trout that live deeper. And I've got Nigropenis on here, but that's blackfin cisco. They're not in Lake Superior, but they are in Lake Nipigon. But we do have short jaw cisco, which is the Xenithicus. Yeah, so, and compared to the other Great Lakes, many of which shared a lot of the same diversity of corygonids historically, Lake Superior is the only one that's maintained a lot of these forms, at least in terms of having this many present. There's at least 2 species that were extirpated historically. Yeah, again, sort of maintaining a surprising diversity compared to the other Great Lakes for the native corygonids. And then for lake trout, we often talk about these things being split into different forms. So those are the lean lake trout, which tend to be further near shore, and it's likely what you would catch if you were sort of out and about and you could still see the shoreline. Humper lake trout, which tend to like offshore shoals. Same with red fins, so you often see these in and around sort of like Ile Royale. And then Ciscoette are the fat lake trout that you'll catch at much greater depths. Yeah. Okay, so there's sort of a bit of a like all about the Lake Superior fishery historically and sort of where it fits within the rest of the Great Lakes in terms of the kinds of different species it supports. I want to switch now a little bit to just highlighting some of the work that my students have led, especially along the North Shore here, but all around the lake, to try and understand sort of some contemporary issues that we're facing for fisheries management in Lake Superior. So one of those issues is walleye recovery and assessment. So there's several spots along the North Shore of Lake Superior where there are walleye recovery plans in place, and it is one of the priorities, I guess, for the Lake Superior fish community. If you look at sort of some of the priorities for the GLFC, related to that, which I think I will hopefully convince you is related to that, are steelhead declines that we've seen in some areas around the lake. We've also done work on spatial variation around Lake Superior, which I'll touch on a little bit today, and some work on sort of assessment methods when we think about what are the best ways to sample the water column in Lake Superior if we're going to use technologies like hydroacoustics to understand how many fish are in the system. And I've been, luckily, and with Brian as well, involved in some work looking at brook trout habitat assessment and availability around tributaries on Lake Superior. I'm not going to have a chance to touch on that today, though. So, but this is just a subsample of some of the students that have done this work. So we've got Marissa Weger, Mark Schutte, Kyle Stratton, Ryan Groh, Cam Leatrance, Mallory Weeb, and Graydon McKee, all of whom have done great work in our lab. And sadly missing from this image, now that I realize it, is Stephen Slongo, who I was lucky enough to co-supervise with Brian McLaren, who did some work on the Aguasaban as well. Okay, so of all that stuff, I'm really just going to try and limit it to the first 4 points here, and hopefully, I think I've got enough time to pull this off, so let's see if we can do it. And I guess before I get too far into it, the one thing that I like to sort of highlight when we're talking about fisheries management is just this quote from John Shepard, which he's kind of famously said, "Managing fisheries is hard. It's like managing a forest in which the trees are invisible and keep moving around," right? So it's when we're dealing with managing fisheries, particularly in an ecosystem the size of Lake Superior, we know the fish are there, but it's really, really hard to know where any one fish is at any given time. So it presents a range of challenges that we've come up with over the years to try and solve in terms of being able to manage these resources. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to talk about is work that was led by Graydon McKee in partnership with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, which is, they've added so many more letters to their name. I'm not going to bother to try and get them all, but anyway. So walleye are piscivorous. They eat other fish. They prefer low light environments. That's why they're called walleye. They've got this what's called a tapetum lucidium. It's a reflective surface on the back of their retina that allows them to see them better in low light conditions. You tend to see them mostly in water temperatures between 18 to 22 degrees Celsius, or that's where they like to hang out in those low light environments. And they are highly sought after for both commercial and recreational fisheries, and important for local communities around the lake as well. And where we conducted this work is right next door in Black Bay on Lake Superior. So Black Bay was the source of the majority of commercially fished walleye on Lake Superior. And that fishery basically shut down in the 1960s for several reasons. I would say, based on our understanding of the system now, it's largely due to overfishing. There's maybe some debate as to whether or not the construction of dams on certain rivers may have impeded their reproduction, but I think we're learning enough about the system to recognize that that's probably not an issue for walleye in Black Bay, or at least, yeah. Anyway, we can talk about that later if we want. So Black Bay is about 60,000 hectares, mostly very shallow, so very different from the rest of Lake Superior, and that 30% of the area of Black Bay is less than 5 meters deep, and that's mostly up in the north part of the bay up here, and over half of it is only down to 15 meters, right? So you can start to see why, and with a mean depth of about 8 meters, and with a silt and clay bottom, you can kind of start to understand why walleye kind of prefer or do well in this sort of environment. And there are forming tributaries around the system. Portage Creek will play an important role a bit later in the talk, and we'll get there. So in order to try and understand some of the issues around management strategies in particular for walleye in this bay, a movement study was initiated back in 2016 in partnership with M&R to try and understand where fish were spending their time in Black Bay, among other research questions. And the reason why that's important is if you go to this, so all of the red dots on this figure are acoustic receivers. So these are little listening devices that we put in the water column. And in the springtime, fish are captured in trap nets, taken to a spot on shore where they're lightly anesthetized, and they receive a surgery, and they're implanted with acoustic transmitter tags. So you make a small incision, pop in your transmitter, sew them back up, and when they look good and vigorous again, you let them back into the lake to swim off. And so the reason we were interested in the movement patterns of these fish is that where this BEI line occurs on the map here, that corresponds to around where Bent Island is. And the fishery, the walleye fishery in Black Bay, is closed to fishing year round above Bent Island. If you want to fish for walleye, it's got to be in this deeper, more southern part of Black Bay. And so we wanted to know, as a management strategy where you're essentially turning the top part of the bay into a fish sanctuary, is that actually protecting walleye in the system? Okay, so this sort of tries to sort of answer that question. What we found was that if you look at sort of the movement patterns of fish in this system, over 80% of the fish that were tagged were detected at this line here at Bent Island. So they're at least migrating as far out as where that sort of sanctuary line is. If you go further than that, out to George Point, you're at 66%, almost 70% of the fish in the bay are at least migrating that far. So these are all fish that are now exposed to potential harvest by recreational fishing. And then a further 50% go out as far as Edward Island, and almost a quarter of the population seems to get out here next to the Sibley Peninsula, and a very small proportion out here towards Nipigon Bay. So some evidence that these fish are actually using a large proportion of Black Bay. And not only that, the fish that are migrating out one year to the next from the top part of the bay outwards into the open part of the lake, that behavior is repeatable. And so this plot here on the left-hand side on the bottom simply shows that essentially fish that migrate to any of these outward migration points in one year are likely to repeat that behavior in a following year. So at least 50% of the population is leaving Black Bay, and a large proportion of those fish, at least for some of the time, are going to be exposed to potential harvest based on the regulations that are and the way they're set up now. And all of those fish, like all of the fish, basically are showing a pattern where they overwinter in this top part of the bay. They leave as temperatures warm up and then return in the fall to overwinter in the top part of the bay as well. So not only did we get a chance to see that we have sort of lots of fish performing these outward bound migrations, not all of those fish were performing those behaviors. Lots of fish like to just hang out in the top part of the bay and not migrate that far at all. And so if you can now split these two fishes into either resident or migratory forms, what we can see is if Graydon was able to take aging structures and back calculate growth rates on these fishes. And what we find is that those migratory fish are achieving larger body sizes on average than these resident fish, you know, by around 10 centimeters at least anyway. So these larger fish seem to be, whatever these fish are migrating for seems to be linked to achieving larger body size. And some additional investigations that we've done seem to suggest that those migrants are also likely primarily female fish, and walleye are a species where females are actually larger than the males. So that's a neat story on its own, but what makes it even more interesting is the potential for where sort of restoration targets conflict with other sort of management priorities. So while all this, you know, work is happening in Black Bay to try and recover that walleye population, in the meantime, we also have steelhead, which occupy a lot of the streams around Black Bay as well. And some long-term monitoring, particularly of that population in Portage Creek of steelhead, is we saw that back in the sort of early 90s, people were worried that, you know, there wasn't a lot of steelhead in this creek. The area or the lands right around the creek were actually posted as private property back in the early 90s. And after that, and with some major monitoring efforts by some, at the time, M&R folks who are now retired, largely, we saw a pretty big recovery of that population in Portage Creek, but then saw a reversal of those trends around 2008, where now the population densities in Portage are even lower than where they started back in the 1990s when people were concerned about the population estimates. Well, what also is interesting is this bottom plot shows the abundance of walleye in an index netting program that had been conducted in Black Bay over the years. And so very low numbers in 2002, but much higher numbers 2008 moving forward. So the recovery, so now we've got a problem because, or well, maybe we don't. I guess it depends on what you're fishing for, right? Walleye fishermen might be happy because they see a recovery of walleye populations in Black Bay. Steelhead fishermen are maybe not so happy because what they're seeing is a decline in the fish that they like to fish for, at least in Black Bay anyway. And what's interesting is that decline in population size is also associated with a big shift in a life history a big life history shift for those steelhead that occupy those streams. And this was fairly unique to Black Bay as well, and the various streams around Black Bay. Most of the fish that returned to spawn would smolt or would leave the stream after only 1 year of residency in the stream. They leave and then they come back a couple years later to spawn. Okay. That is a relatively unusual life history for other streams on Lake Superior. What we've noticed is that over time, if you look at what the life history of those returning fish are, we've gone from a shift from having fish that are returning that smolted 1 year in the stream to becoming very uncommon. And most of the fish that we see returning are actually now spending 2 years in the stream. And Kyle Stratton, and we see this not just in the Portage Creek tributary, but we also see it in with fewer data points in some of these other tributaries like the Wolf River and Coldwater Creek as well. And so, and what's interesting is that this life history shift can also be predicted on the basis, if you put together sort of a simulation model, which Kyle's done now, to look at what you might expect as an outcome of increased predation on young individuals, which is what you'd see through mortality from walleye consumption, like walleye eating rainbow smelt or rainbow trout, sorry, you'd expect this shift in life histories. Whereas if it was because of harvesting of adults by anglers or something like that, you wouldn't expect this outcome. So yeah, so now you kind of have to make a decision, I guess. Do you manage a fishery for steelhead or do you manage a fishery for walleye? But not only that, what's also interesting is this shift in life histories also suggests that there may be some hope for steelhead in these systems, in that if they spend 2 years in the river before they smolt and go out to the lake, then maybe that gives them enough of a size advantage that they won't be as susceptible to predation by walleye in these systems. And in most other tributaries, like if you look at what steelhead do in either Thunder Bay or in Nipigon Bay, almost all of those streams support fish that smolt after 2 years. So one could look at this as that, you know, maybe Black Bay was unique in the first place because it was depleted of walleye for so long. And now what we're seeing is a shift in the life history for steelhead in this system to reflect what we see in most of the other tributaries around Lake Superior. And, you know, ultimately, hopefully that will help these populations switch to a more beneficial life history in the presence of walleye. I'm gonna have to maybe shut this down. So I'm gonna skip this part on spatial variation. What I will say, so this was work that was done by Marissa Weger. I'll just talk about it quickly because it's really cool. This was work done by Marissa Weger where we partnered up on the last actually CSMI year on Lake Superior, which was conducted in 2016. And what we saw is that, so this is a work by a whole bunch of different agencies which collect as much data as they can around the lake on about a 5-year cycle. And so we focused on the fish. And what we wanted to do was just try and answer the question as to whether a lake trout or a smelt that you catch in the Western Arm, is that the same fish as it is in Whitefish Bay or in Nipigon Bay? Because when we think about sort of food webs of Lake Superior, we often think about it in simple terms like lake trout in Lake Superior do this and they eat these things. And what she was able to show, and I'll just maybe focus on this slide here, is if we were able to use stable isotopes of the tissues of these fish to tell us about how much they were relying on offshore versus nearshore resources as an indicator of like where do they fit in the ecology of the lake. And what she showed pretty clearly is if you take a lake trout from the Keweenaw Peninsula, that lake trout is not playing the same ecological role as it is in Whitefish Bay. Or similarly for, a smelt that you collect from the Keweenaw Peninsula versus what you might see in Whitefish Bay. And that's true of several other areas here. And then interesting, at least for two species, One being lake whitefish, which are typically benthivores, eating things off the bottom, and rainbow smelt, which are typically planktivores, so eating things in the water column. If you look at how they function based on their conversion efficiency, how efficiently they turn the food they eat into body mass, these relationships work really well where you see that they are at sites where they're actually taking advantage of the things that they should be eating. So if you've got a whitefish, which is supposed to eat a lot of benthos, where they do, they have a higher conversion efficiency than when they're feeding more on planktonic resources, and the opposite is true of smelt. So it's encouraging because it lines up with what we know about these species. The last thing I'm going to talk about is work that our PhD, one of the PhD students in our lab, Ryan Groh, is working on, looking at a platform-based deployment of acoustic telemetry, or sorry, hydroacoustic surveys. So what we'd normally do if we were going to try and understand the density of fish in the lake based on a hydroacoustic survey is we've got it's essentially, you know, a several $100,000 fish finder is one way to think about it, mounted on the bottom of a ship facing down into the water column. And as you drive over, you get responses of fish on an echogram that you can use to estimate density. The problem with that is, you know, boats are noisy. And so there's a question about whether or not there's some issue of boat avoidance. But also you lose your ability to see what's between the surface and about 3 meters out from the face of the transducer that you're using to look into the water column. So most of the time, these ship-based deployments, you don't even know what's going on in the top 10 meters of the water, which could be really important in terms of other, like what's actually happening. So this is work, this actually just summarizes Ryan's field work that was conducted last fall in Thunder Bay. So these survey lines represent mobile surveys that were conducted by M&R, and these orange dots represent different points along those surveys where we also deployed that up-looking hydroacoustic transducer. And when you compare sort of the estimates of fish density from these two methods, what we found is that the measurements that were taken from that up-looking stationary unit, which is in blue here, were almost, well, on average, at least 2 out of the 3 sites higher than what we would see in the ship-based surveys. And on average, that was about 3 times higher. So we've, you know, annoyingly, this, so, you know, but this is preliminary data. The good news is that Ryan's done a second year of data collection just this past fall to help try and better understand if this is a real pattern or not. But it does match up with some other work that's been done by the USGS that he was also involved in with an up-looking tow body-based transducer. What's really interesting and what was consistent is if you look at what's the density of fish in that upper portion of the water column, so looking at sort of from 10 meters up, so now recognizing that for the ship we've lost a bunch of that part of the water column because we can't actually see it with how the transducer is mounted, we see 17 times higher fish densities using this platform-based deployment as opposed to the mobile deployment, suggesting that ignoring what's going on in that top 10 or top 5 meters with a traditional ship-based assessment could be really important, because what it means is that overall we may actually be underestimating the density of fish that are in the system, particularly of organisms that tend to be in that top 10 meters. Okay, so I'll wrap it up. So we've got a little bit of time for questions. Just to say it's important, hopefully what I've been able to show you today with some of the research that we've been doing is that it's important with the walleye story to consider migration patterns and conservation efforts, and that, you know, we may need to consider potential for competing interests in what it is that we're trying to conserve and how to weigh that, those potential conflicts. Lake Superior is big, and as such, those big spatial differences mean that, you know, even at a species level, a lake trout on one end of the lake may not ecologically be the same as that same species on the other side of the lake. And that these stationary-based survey methods may help us improve acoustic-based estimates of abundance that we see in Lake Superior, as well as characterization of fish habitat use. Okay, and I think I'm going to leave it there. So thanks again, everyone, for attending today, and to Rachel for inviting me, and hopefully you learned something.
Yeah, that was great, Mike. I know I learned a lot. Did my master's at UMD, so I went to a fair number of presentations about fish in Lake Superior, but I certainly learned some new things. So we've got, about 10 minutes, and I would love to open it up for other folks to ask questions. Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute. We're a small group, so I think we can just handle asking questions that way.
Okay.
Or if you'd rather I read it out, you can add it to the chat.
Hey, Mike, I just wanted to go back to some of the historical stuff you were talking about. And is there any information around the sea lamprey or the lamprey impacts in the rivers systems? Does it have any countering effect on fish populations?
Well, I mean, it's meant to be lamprey specific, right? Which it is. The downside is we've got plenty of native lamprey too. So if you're interested in things like brook lamprey or silver lamprey or any of the other, I think there's 4 species in total that are native in the region, none of which are parasitic, by the way. Only sea lamprey are parasitic on adult fishes. Yeah, it's going to have negative impacts on those species as well. The application of it is meant to be, again, sort of species specific, but yeah, it definitely isn't good for those native lamprey species. Yeah, there has been a fair amount of work to try and make sure that the effects of lampricide on other non-target species are low. The one thing I'm not positive about is things like freshwater mussels. I can't remember. I have in my back of my head, I have something nagging that maybe there's something there, but I can't think about it. But anyway, but for the most part, it's meant to be, yeah, fairly targeted. But then you do end up with this problem where you've got all these native species now that are suffering as a consequence of this control measure.
So. Yeah, the long-term food chain. I remember hearing some people talking about bass nests in particular being affected by them, but I don't think there's any research about it, just more local.
Yeah, and I guess that would have to be, well, yeah, and then you can also ask the question, like, if you're worried about bass, are bass really native up here either? So anyway, I guess the other thing I would say is that I think there is still interest in trying to find other control measures besides lampricide, right? And so a lot of the work that's happening, especially in the Sault Ste. Marie area, they're looking at light traps and pheromone traps and that sort of stuff, where if you can take advantage of some of those sort of aspects of biology of, at least for adult lamprey, and keep them out of the streams before they can reproduce again, that could be another sort of important control measure to implement that might ultimately help us move away from lampricides as well. Yeah, Don?
Yeah, nice job, Mike. It's good to hear some of the newer work that you guys have been doing. Just to keep on the lamprey theme a little bit, there is a lake sturgeon protocol with lamprey treatment. So lake sturgeon are a susceptible fish species that, of course, we're trying to restore as well. But they've done a lot of work with TFM effects on lake sturgeon. So that's one thing. But and I was on the Sea Lamprey Control Committee for about 15 years, so got quite a good background here. But the one thing I'm really wondering about is what's going on with the Black Sturgeon Dam. You mentioned that you didn't think that maybe the migration of walleye up the stream, which the anglers think is critical to restore that population, is important. Maybe it's restoring itself on its own with shoreline reproduction. I'm not quite sure, but removing that dam, of course, then you've got a whole nother can of worms to deal with. First off, you've got like 50 to 60 miles more of sea lamprey control you need to do. You've got more sea lamprey coming out. You've got the sturgeon, you know, which I just talked about being susceptible to control. It's just a can of worms, and I'm wondering where Ontario is at with removing that dam. Or
No, they didn't. They basically rebuilt it because it got to the point where it was about to fall apart.
Yep.
And it was sort of 11th hour evidence, but from some of that same telemetry study had receivers going all the way up the Black Sturgeon up to the Camp 43 dam.
Yep.
And what we found is that walleye, so at least half the walleye that we tagged in Black Bay are using the Black Sturgeon. However, they're only going up the first several kilometers of the river. And if you look at, you know, all the receivers that are at or near the face of the dam, and far enough away from the dam that you don't have to worry about acoustic interference from the water turbulence, you know, we've got maybe, you know, of the 100 and some tagged fish that went up the river, maybe 1 or 2 went all the way to the dam front. And so if that is actually a barrier to fish movement, you'd expect them all to pile up at the dam, but you don't see that. So, and not only that, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence from some old reports and commercial fisheries harvest from back in the 60s when that was going on in Black Bay, of fishermen targeting shoals up along sort of around Herkett Cove and the old mouth of the Wolf River. And so, yeah, so actually that's the main focus of what acoustic telemetry work is going on in Black Bay right now. So they've set up a really tight grid along that sort of region up in the top part, and we're monitoring that over the spring period to see if we can gain evidence for congregation. Well, and we do along those areas, but they've now put in a VPS system so they can actually track, you know, on a 3-minute basis where an actual fish is, not just sort of what receiver did it get seen on. And the plan is once they nail that down pretty good, they're going to be deploying egg mats in a future year to try and look at, can we actually get evidence of spawning in these regions? So I would say, you know, so the dam itself, I don't think was any barrier to reproduction for the population that's there now.
Well, that's excellent work where your research justified, you know, what we should be doing. And as a mostly lake trout biologist, I just assume not, you know, there's walleyes all over the place in Minnesota and Northern Ontario. If you want to go fish walleyes, go someplace else, you know. Anyway, lake trout, you know, the damage that the sea lamprey could have done to lake trout in Minnesota and around Isle Royal and, you know, the Thunder Bay area, that would have been devastating, I think, because it would have cost millions of dollars to treat that system because it's big and it's really tough to get to, as you guys know.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll let somebody else ask some questions.
Sure, but definitely get to that point about competing interests for
absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, we have time for another question if anyone has one.
Go ahead, Reg.
Yeah, I was just curious. Since the North Basin of Black Bay is so shallow, is there potential for this uplooking sort of sounder to be used to monitor populations there?
Yeah, that's tough. So that's the one real limitation to this. I mean, but so for any hydroacoustic survey to work, even if it was boat mounted up there, 5 meters is not enough because you're you know, the angle on the cone, I think it's like 8 or 9 degrees or something like that. So the further you can look, the more area you cover and the greater volume of water that you're surveying. So where we've done our deployments in Thunder Bay, those are down anywhere between 30 to 50 meters. Yeah, it gets pretty challenging to deploy those things in water that's any more shallow. But what does work really well up in those more shallow regions in Black Bay is this acoustic telemetry approach, where of course it requires collecting the fish first, shoving transmitters in them and then letting them go again. So it's a bit more work in that sense, but gives you a really good idea, actually, depending on the kind of system you can afford to set up, about habitat use and where fish are actually using those parts of the environment. So yeah.
Mike, just a quick follow-up. When you were saying when you were collecting the fish and adding the transmitter,
Yep.
they were collected from the north part of the bay and then also released in the north part of the bay. I think I just missed the location for.
Yeah, I would say the majority were captured at the Black Sturgeon River, Hercot Cove, but there were collections that went down. So they did manage to trap fish down along, I guess, the western shore of Black Bay. And so there were collections made down around Portage Creek and a couple of other spots up the shoreline. But you're right. I mean, I guess the one caveat of that study is a lot of the fish that were tagged in that study did originate from the north part of the bay. That said, even though that's where most of those fish started, we still see this sort of difference in habitat use, where you've got a large chunk of the population that migrates out of the bay and a large chunk that just sort of utilizes that sort of top half of it and never really leaves too. So yeah.
Do you know how many, like what percentage of the fish left and never came back, as opposed to migrating in and out? They just like, took off?
Yeah. I'd need to double check that. Well, so
it's small, or I mean.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely had some losses of individuals over time. The survivor rates were actually reasonably good in that study compared to other places where we've done walleye telemetry work, like on Lake Winnipeg. Christ, half of them are gone in a year. Like anyway, but what was telling in that study is that of the fish that we saw for 2 years in a row, the behavior, that migratory or residency behavior, was repeatable. So the ones that migrated 1 year also migrated that second year, and the ones that stuck around the bay in 1 year stuck around the bay in the second year. So gave us some confidence that this wasn't just sort of one-off random movement. It seems to be sort of a behavioral syndrome that we're looking at.
Yeah, thanks. I had forgotten about that a bit too. Thank you. Yeah, great. Well, thanks everybody. We like to end hopefully a minute early, which we're at. If you're interested in the Lake Superior Living Labs Network as a whole, our website is livinglabsnetwork.org. If you'd like to be on our newsletter list or get emails about other events such as this, we call them mini meetups, feel free to email me and we can add you to those email lists. Otherwise, thank you to Mike. I think we all learned a lot. It seems like that was well received, and we appreciate the details. And this will be posted on our website by the end of next week. So if you'd like to review it or share it with somebody else, that can happen as well.
Great. Thanks everyone for attending today. It was good to see everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend, folks.
See you.
Bye.